So for those of you that don't know, if you're not familiar, OOPSLA is another conference, much like TLDI, and they're currently in the midst of deciding which papers will appear at this year's OOPSLA. So thank you very much, Ali, for taking this time. So Ali is a reader at Imperial College London. I never actually remember how the various ranks in the British system map to the ranks in the American system. And he's also, I guess, started a company that was recently bought by Google, so he's spending quite a lot of time there, if I'm not mistaken. And so take it away, Ali.
Thank you. Thanks very much. It's a real pleasure to be here at PLMW, and I'm sorry that due to the PC meeting, I've not been able to attend the rest of the event. So I don't know who you are, so could you raise your hand if you're a PhD student currently? Great. And who is pre-PhD? And who is faculty? And is anyone not an academic? Okay, cool. Well, nice to meet you all. So I thought that I would talk to you about the thing that I find the most stressful in research, which is novelty. And I thought I might try and offer some words of advice and maybe some comfort for things that you can do when you're having a bit of difficulty with novelty, okay? And just to be clear here, by novelty, I'm not talking about a small and inexpensive toy or ornament. I'm talking about trying to do new things in research, okay? So, as researchers, novelty has got very high importance. It's really fundamental to what we do as scientists. We get satisfaction from doing new things, and we advance the state of the art by doing new things. It's kind of, for many of us, the reason we get up in the morning to do our jobs as researchers. But pragmatically speaking, novelty can also be something we're obliged to come up with, right? If you want to get research funded, at least in the United Kingdom, a tremendous amount of importance is placed on novelty. There are words like transformative and groundbreaking, and I don't think people actually say earth-shattering, but you know what I mean, right? So there's an awful lot of importance placed on novelty when going for funding. And if you want to get papers published, novelty is usually one of the main criteria that's stated in the call for papers of a conference. And at this OOPSLA PC meeting, novelty has come up again and again and again. You know, this looks very interesting, but what's new? What's new about it? And it's kind of amazing that we get paid to get up and think of novel ideas every day as researchers. I think that's one of the best things about being researchers. But this can also be quite daunting. So what I want to talk about is when can novelty be challenging and what can we do about it? Okay, so sometimes when I'm thinking of ideas, I sort of think, you know, that might work pretty well. That's a good idea. Is it new? I think it's new, but then would it be perceived as being new? Right, how would I make it clear that it is new? I think it's new, but have I read enough literature to know that it's new? Or maybe I think it's related to X, but I'm pretty sure it's different from X, but I can't really understand X because X is so poorly written. So what am I going to say in my paper? How am I going to defend my work as being novel compared with X? And sometimes I think this kind of thought process can lead to searching for novelty rather than doing what you actually think is sensible or what you want to do. Thinking, there's a deadline coming up in November for a conference beginning with P. What could I do that would be novel for that conference? And that's maybe not a very good way to think. Okay, so I'm going to give you a bunch of examples where I think novelty could be hard and some techniques that you might use to deal with that. But first of all, I wondered, do any of you have experiences where novelty's been a challenge of any sort? Please, I'd love to hear some of your ideas. Yeah, please.
Yeah, what are you supposed to write in your personal statements?
What are you supposed to write in your personal statements? Do you mean when you're applying for a program? Yeah, right. So that's I suppose that's the thing that people coming from high school have. The first thing is, what do I do to stand out? Yep, very good. Anything else? Yes.
Well, we've been trying to apply OpenGL techniques in machine learning, and we've achieved state-of-the-art results, but we're having trouble getting our work published because we're not doing a lot of groundbreaking new PL. We're just saying people haven't applied PL to this area before, and we have, and this sort of better results.
Right, that's very interesting. I'm not going to try and repeat all of these remarks, by the way, because I think that would be laborious, and I hope, yeah, if you speak as loud as you did, I don't think I need to. Yeah, very interesting. Any other thoughts? Yeah, please.
I'm sending you some stuff that new language for Irish people learning, but it's hard to convince people that the language that is done actually is better than what they're using.
Right, so you come up with a new language for a new problem, and people say, oh, but this could be expressed in some other language. Is it necessary to have your language? And you go, no, it's not necessary, but it's sensible. How do you know it's sensible? Did you do a user study? Oh, well, how am I going to get 100 people who are all equivalent? to do my IoT user study. Yeah, that's very difficult, a very difficult problem. And I think it can stifle people trying, actually, because it can be quite hard. But I encourage you to keep trying. Okay, and maybe one more? Yeah, please, Adrian.
One time we got tired of implementing a bunch of similar optimizations for a compiler, and we made a framework to make it really easy to build those optimizations. It was impossible to publish the paper because it just seemed like we were implementing the same old optimizations in a different way.
Right. So people would want you to show that you could do 100 more optimizations in the compiler, and then you'd have to implement all by hand anyway to compare. Yeah. Okay, very good. All right. So the idea of this talk is it's a cookbook of suggestions to help you when novelty is thin. It's not meant to be idealistic. Okay? They're like tactics to cope with scenarios that maybe you wish you weren't in, or scenarios that do arise very naturally. I hope you'll agree that everything I'm going to suggest here is ethical, and part of the reason I hope that is that I've employed almost all of the techniques I'm going to show you here in my career. Okay, and I'm going to illustrate throughout the talk with some examples from my own career. I'm going to show you a bunch of my papers. I'm going to show you some success stories where there were things that were difficult novelty-wise that ended up leading to nice things like paper awards and that kind of thing. So I hope you'll forgive me for doing a little bit of self-promotion there. I don't really mean it to be self-promotion. It's just that I know the most about myself, so I can give lots of examples there. Okay, and many of these ideas relate to practical work in programming languages with tools and experiments. If you're doing more theoretical work, then I hope you can draw some obvious analogs. I'm not going to try and give a theory analog for each case here. And also, I think many of these ideas extend beyond programming languages. They're more about research. Some of them are a bit PL specific, but many of them not so. Okay, so the talk is going to be a choose your own adventure talk. We have 5 sections. We may not have time to go through them all, but that's okay. So, what would you like to do first? So there's coping with a crowded field, coping with getting scooped, helping a floundering student, advancing on flawed prior work, or no wow factor. No wow factor, okay. Try a journal. So it can be really difficult to get papers accepted at conferences like PLDI and Popple and Uppsala, partly because the bar is high, but partly because your paper's being compared against a whole stack of other papers. And there's a bit of a tendency for reviewers to want to look for the big new idea in each paper. And often a complaint you get with this stack of papers is that there's no especially big new idea in this paper. So in our field, in programming languages, the truth is that conferences, and I include conferences that publish in PAC and PL as conferences here. I'm not regarding that as although I really think it's a fantastic initiative, I'm not regarding that as a journal in this sense. There are very respectable journals in our field, and if you've got a paper that makes a sensible increment, or maybe makes a number of related contributions that are collectively very worth publishing, but it's not like one of them is the wow contribution, then your work might fare better if you send it to a journal than a conference. There's time for revisions, and you're not being compared against a stack of other papers. So to give you some examples from my career, there's a paper that I got rejected from Uppsala 2014 about invariant generation for static analysis of GPU programs. I think it was a pretty good paper. It got pretty good reviews from Uppsala, but they were a bit lukewarm. They said, yeah, this is fine. There's nothing really wrong with it. It's kind of cool. Could definitely be interesting to someone, but there's not really the big idea the hooky idea that an Uppsala paper needs to have. It took us quite a few years to actually then get around to getting this paper journal ready, but eventually we got it published in a decent software engineering journal, IEEE Transactions on Software Engineering. Another more recent paper was a paper about termination analysis for GPU kernels. This was a paper that my postdoc Jeroen saw it would be kind of fun to do, relatively straightforward, it should just work. He did it, it did just work. And our prediction was that it would be a bit of a pain to get it published at some conference. It probably wouldn't be the most exciting talk, but it was very nice work that was worth publishing. So we sent it to a decent journal and it got in, and that was a good experience. Okay, so I would say that sometimes if I think you should be ambitious, and I think you should usually try and get things published at the best place you think they could be published. But I think if you're having trouble because of wire factor, then a journal could be a good thing to consider. Another thing you might consider is a case study. So this is a paper that I also have in another section of the talk, Floating Point Symbolic Execution, a case study in N-version programming. This paper's got 2 stories behind it. We may get to the other one in a bit. But actually, my and Christian Cadow's student, Dan, had a plan to do some quite ambitious work to do with floating point support in symbolic execution. But for various good reasons, it took a long time to get to the point of doing that work. And we also found out that there was another research group who were also doing very similar work. And what we did is we actually teamed up with them and we kind of got into the situation where they'd kind of done a whole lot of work and we'd done a whole lot of work, and it was too late for either of us to backtrack. So what we did is we agreed we wouldn't tell each other any more about the work, and we would carry on doing it independently but in a controlled manner, and then compare our findings. So this led to like a 2-version programming case study that we sent to the Automated Software Engineering Conference, and we actually sent it especially in the experience reports category for that conference because we thought it was different, a bit wacky, a bit strange compared to a normal research paper, but a very interesting study nevertheless. And the paper was well received there. It actually won the Best Experience Report award at ASE 2017. So this was a paper with relatively low novelty, but some quite interesting characteristics about it, in particular how we teamed up with this other group that I think we would have had trouble publishing in a more straightforward context, but it worked out well for us in this context. And while I think all these awards are a little bit silly, the fact is they are very useful from a career perspective. I'm hopefully going to go up for a promotion to full professor in a few years, and all these paper awards and things, they definitely help with that kind of thing, right? So remember, not talking ideals here, talking a little bit of tactics. All right. One thing you can do if your work doesn't have conceptual wow factor is you can show that it works really well in practice, and that can often give you that push that gets your work published in top places when you might struggle otherwise to get it published in a top place based on the idea alone. So I've got a personal story here, which is I was really inspired by 2 excellent papers on compiler testing, both published at PLDI by other researchers. The first is a paper on CSmith. It's a random program generator, a random generator of C programs that has some nice properties and can be used to differentially test C compilers. This is from the University of Utah. And then there's a paper from UC Davis, which is on equivalence modulo inputs testing for C compilers. I don't have time to go into the details of these papers, but they were very nice papers for finding bugs in C compilers. And I set a master's project for someone to take these ideas and extend them so they could be applied to OpenGL, which is a GPU programming model. So my master's student, Chris, at the time, did this piece of work, and it was kind of like a reproduction study with some novel twists. We had to do some novel things to get this stuff to work for OpenGL, but it wasn't super novel. The idea was we were really trying to see whether these ideas that were successful in the domain of C would also be successful in the domain of OpenGL. And we sent this work to PLDI, and it was the first time wasn't the first time I submitted to PLDI, but it was the first time I was accepted to PLDI. And I think the acceptance came from partly the novel twists, but partly having 21 different OpenGL implementations that we ran experiments on. Now, this required a lot of time, and it also did require a certain amount of GPU resources available to us, and I appreciate that my university was able to purchase some devices, but it wasn't terribly expensive. But we were able to do a whole load of experiments on a whole load of devices and find many, many bugs and show that our little novel twists led to us being able to find these bugs, and that is what got the paper into PLDI, rather than a big new idea in the paper. Then we did a follow-on work on OpenGL compilers, which was published at the OOPSLA 2017 conference. And this had a couple more novelty twists, but still no big new idea. But what we were able to do here was actually find a whole lot of really interesting bugs in OpenGL implementations where you have correct images on the left here and wrong images on the right here, and the deltas shown in purple are semantics preserving changes we made to programs that induced these compiler bugs. And so yeah, this, because we had lots of experimental results on lots of platforms, this was able to get us into a good programming languages conference, despite there not being a really big conceptual new thing in the paper. And actually these bugs, we found so many of them, and we ended up building quite a usable product because we had to do such a big evaluation that we ended up doing a startup company based on this work, and that's the company that was bought by Google recently, hence my joint appointment with Google. So for me, it's kind of fun having this adventure with Google now. In some sense, that's arisen due to lack of novelty, in part. If our idea had been more novel, we wouldn't have needed to do such a big evaluation, so we wouldn't have built a tool, so we wouldn't have known the tool worked so well, so we wouldn't have done the company, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, and one other thing is consider a different community. So I'm not suggesting here, sneak your paper into a community who won't understand your work. That would be unethical. But what sometimes can be the case is that, say you've done some work in verification, sometimes the verification community can be very harsh. They can really want things to be very scalable or very theoretically elegant or whatever it is. And if you've done something that's a clever use of some verification ideas, they may not be terribly interested in that. The systems community have a very high bar for work on finding bugs in operating systems, etc. And I had a student who'd done a nice piece of work that was about finding bugs in device drivers using symbolic analysis. It was a good combination of verification techniques applied to a systems problem. He wanted to move on to another piece of work. This was definitely worth publishing, and I made the bet that actually we might be more appreciated by the software engineering community, who would see this as a nice combination of ideas applied to an important problem. It wouldn't be too concerned about whether there was massive novelty in the verification techniques or whether we were being absolutely state-of-the-art on the system side of things. So what I'd say is that sometimes thinking if your work isn't being appreciated by some communities, maybe due to lack of novelty, but you think that the work is nevertheless interesting, maybe think if there's another community who might be more receptive to the domain that you're applying the work in. Okay, and the final thing here is shelve it somewhere reasonable, which I would distinguish from the last category. The last category is you don't work you're very proud of, you think it's got potential, but you think you need to look at a particular open-minded community. But there can, let's face it, be cases where maybe you have a student, or maybe you are a student and some work is done, is not super exciting for whatever reason. It's also not scientifically flawed. There isn't anyone who wants to take it further. Maybe the student has left, or maybe you are the student and you really want to move on to something different. And it's certainly worth communicating. It would seem like a waste of all the time you put in not to get this work published. There are going to be people who would benefit from reading it, but you know it's just not going to, or maybe you've tried and been told it's not going to make the cut for top venues, then there's no shame, in my opinion, in publishing it somewhere okay but lower ranked. I know some people are quite snobbish about this, but I would really say it's better for the world that you do get your work published than that you don't, if the work is reasonable work. So don't be afraid to do that, but don't do it because you're frightened. Do it because you have a good reason to do it. Okay? So now we're going to go back to the menu. Okay, what would you like to focus on next? Yeah, please. Helping a friend and student. Okay. So let's say you're an advisor and you've got a student who's not doing so well. Well, the first thing is, if the problems are really severe, you should get the student help. And that's not the focus of this presentation, but that is one of the hardest things about being a faculty member in my experience. That it's very difficult being a PhD student. PhD students have problems, and something that you maybe have to deal with more often than you might imagine is students' problems and helping them out. And you have to work with your university on that. But that's not the focus of this presentation. So let's imagine that a student is well enough to work, but for whatever reason, they're not really managing to break new ground in their work. Maybe they're struggling to find a problem to work on, or maybe you've given them a problem, but they're not making progress on it, and they're getting down about maybe not having published anything or not feeling like they're making any progress. So here are a few ideas of things you can do. One thing I've employed several times that's been quite successful is have a student help out for a while on another project. I mentioned doing these big experimental studies. And those big experimental studies, they need people. You need several people to work on those studies. And it can be very useful for one researcher or student to have another researcher help them out for a while. So if you've got a student who's floundering a bit, then actually giving them the opportunity to help out on another project in some meaningful way can be really reassuring for them. They might work on extra case studies, whether theoretical case studies or practical experiments. They might push benchmarks through a tool, which could be something that is really important to do to show evidence that the approach is working well, or to compare with another technique, but is maybe hard for the sole author of a piece of work to do on their own. Or add features or documentation or fix bugs. So by helping out on another project, your student can maybe get to be co-author on a resulting paper, which is nice for them CV-wise and career-wise. They probably bond with the other researchers on that project. Yeah, hopefully things go well and they end up feeling happier because their friendship group is increased. And also it gives them a buffer in which to work out what they really want to do, and maybe gives them some confidence in their own ideas by having exposure to this other student's work. There's of course a danger that this could just be a source of procrastination for the student, and that's definitely something you need to be careful of. You can't just have someone who keeps helping out on lots of projects but doesn't ever find their own thing to work on. But it's something to consider. Another thing is a targeted workshop paper. So if you're an ambitious academic, you might not particularly consider sending your work to workshops. But I think that's a shame. I think workshops are often more interesting to attend than conferences. And the other thing is that workshops are usually happy to get papers, and workshop reviews are often very kind and very insightful, and it can be pretty depressing sending your work to these top programming languages conferences and getting it rejected. And it can actually be really nice sending your work to a workshop and getting really long reviews that are maybe quite targeted because the people know a lot about what you're doing because it's a focused workshop. And then you have a chance to go and present your work and meet people, and the presentation is not as stressful as presenting at a conference. And this can be a good way to bed in with the community, get a chance to present, have maybe, if it's a workshop with proceedings, maybe have something that you've published, because that often is very meaningful to students. And yeah, have your work appreciated in a more gentle environment. And that can be useful in building the confidence needed to relax and then think novel thoughts. If you remember my first slide, those kind of cyclic thoughts that one can have about, is this good enough, is this novel enough, will this be perceived as novel? I think it's hard to have those thoughts if you're stressed. And I think sometimes having a few less mature ideas, having a chance to present them, maybe publish them, can then lead you into a better frame of mind to come up with novel thoughts. I haven't had a ton of experience doing this, but it's something that I've definitely used myself when I've had an idea I'm not sure about, and it's something I've done with a few of my students in the past. Any thoughts on this, by the way? Do feel free to interrupt if you want to comment on any of these points. I think a challenge for junior advisors, and I guess this is probably more of a challenge in the USA where you have tenure, is weighing up your personal ambition with what's right for your students. So I know that some academics don't really want to send their work to workshops because that's not going to be prestigious and it's not going to add to their tenure case. But I think you've got to really think carefully about what's right for the student here. And if you've got a student who's going to benefit from maybe giving away a top idea to a workshop publication, if that's going to make the student happier and having a more fulfilling PhD experience and lead them to do better work, then it's the right thing to do and you should do it. Okay, back to the menu then. So what would you like next? We've done helping a Foundry student and no wow factor. So we've got coping with a crowded field, coping with getting scooped, or advancing. Coping with getting scooped, okay. So, oh, sorry, that's the wrong one. Oh, I don't have a way to go back. Oh no. Sorry. Well, I'm now completely lost. So coping with getting scooped. Okay, so scooped is where someone else has an idea at the same time or just before you. They get there just before you. So one thing is, if you're lucky enough to know that you're about to be scooped, you may be able to collaborate with the people who would otherwise scoop you. And this is actually what happened in that paper I mentioned about the n-version programming. I'll show you again here. So the one thing the paper says is, coincidentally, we, the two research groups who co-authored this paper, undertook such an extension of CLE independently and at roughly the same time. When we became aware of each other's activities via communication on the CLE mailing list, we set up a meeting to understand the status and maturity of each implementation, aiming to avoid duplication of effort. It became clear that we were too late. Both teams had already invested significant effort and created mostly complete implementations. But this coincidence gave us a valuable opportunity. So you need to think creatively sometimes as a researcher. Think, is there some way you could turn this bad situation into a good opportunity for both groups? And we were lucky enough that both our group and the group at Aachen University, who'd also done this floating point extension to CLE, were interested in doing a collaboration, and we did this kind of fun n-version programming case study. But more generally, if you think that someone might be working on a similar problem to you, it's probably better to talk to them and understand what they're working on and see whether you can collaborate with them, or maybe if you can actually negotiate to work on slightly different aspects of the problem so you don't scoop each other, because it's not really in anyone's interest to get into this scooping game. Okay, suppose you have been scooped. You've probably not been completely scooped. It's almost inconceivable that someone will solve a problem in exactly the same way that you've solved the problem. That may be less true in theoretical areas where maybe there's a proof of a theorem and someone else proves it, and a proof's a proof. But in most areas of computing, then there's going to be some room for differentiation here. So the devil's in the detail. So rather than trying to evade the fact you've been scooped, I would advise you to spell out the details really boldly. Reviewers really dislike vagueness, but reviewers usually appreciate candor. So go ahead and explain exactly why you're similar to another technique, but then why you're not the same as that technique and what the differences are, and try to make the most of those differences and try and evaluate them experimentally or show theoretically what they are. I think reviewers are typically pretty sympathetic to the idea that it's horrible to get scooped, and if you spell things out well, you could often benefit from that sympathy, because reviewers are academics themselves normally.
Can I jump in
Yeah, please, yeah.
for a second? So this is actually something, especially those of you that are junior researchers, something that happens all the time is you are working on a problem in your first, second year of grad school, and you're reading the related work, and you read a paper, and you go to your advisor and say, oh crap, somebody said exactly what I did. And I can tell you from experience that it is never true. You will often read a paper and think that you have been scooped, and you almost certainly have not been scooped. Read the paper carefully, figure out what you're doing that is different than what other people are doing. There will almost invariably be important differences that you can focus on.
And go to your advisor.
Yeah, go to your advisor.
Yeah.
And they will help you with this. But it happens all the time. I would say every one of my students has had at least one experience.
Definitely. Okay, another thing you can do is an excellent evaluation. So the devil is in the detail, and details probably lead to differences in effectiveness. So you might be able to find, if it's some logical framework, or you might be able to find examples that could be solved in your framework but not in your competitors, and critically find examples the other way around too. Experimentally show why your technique works better than their technique, and find examples the other way around as well, and present them both. And what I found when I've been a bit scooped, usually by showing both sides of the coin, I've got pretty positive reviews who've said, I really like the way you didn't just show your technique was better than theirs, because that's not usually ever the case, right? Usually their approaches are rather complementary. So yeah, openly showing the pros and cons is often really appreciated. And another thing you can do, especially if the scooping is very recent, is just state that discoveries were made independently. If it's true, it's true, and you can say, we recently discovered there's this other work by so-and-so that was done independently, and then you can spell out the details. But don't be afraid to just say this was done independently. Reviewers are humans, reviewers have been scooped. They will understand, or may understand. You should definitely give them the chance to understand, rather than make them think you read that other paper and had a very similar idea, which is unfair on yourself. Okay, so I think we've got one more then, which is, oh, we've got two more, crowded field or advancing on flawed prior work. I think we only have time for one of these, so which would you like? Flawed prior work, okay. So, you'll excuse my language here. You might have heard of this phenomenon. If you want to be successful as an academic, but just quickly successful, find an area, do something that just scratches the surface, get a paper at PLDI or Popple or wherever, and then leave the area. Find another area, do something that just scratches the surface, get a paper at Top Place, leave the area. And what you do is you ruin the area for everyone else, because they can't come along and claim to be the first, but also what you've done isn't very substantial, and if they come along and do something more substantial, it's like, oh, wasn't this all done by so-and-so? And then you have to explain why what you've done is a bit more substantial. So please don't do this. It spoils the field for everyone. So how can you make your work shine if someone has come and done this to your area? A related but different phenomenon is impenetrable prior work. So someone has not come and tried to mess up the field. They've just come and messed it up by writing a paper that is full of really good ideas that are really poorly explained. And you have ideas that you can articulate well, and you know they're related to those other ideas, but you can't really explain quite why they're different or if they are different, because you don't properly understand those ideas. And it somehow doesn't seem satisfactory to say, we believe our approach is related to X, but we can't understand that paper well enough. You can't say that, but at the same time, you may feel like you can't actually articulate what the differences are. So this is a bit similar to what I said in the last section. Again, you can do a candid comparison. I had one experience where there was a paper, and I won't give examples here, but I had one experience where there was a paper that is a decent paper, but I found very hard to understand. I did something quite similar, and I just couldn't work out how to, in a principled way, explain what the differences are. But luckily, that other paper had an available tool, and I was able to do an experimental comparison and show that my technique, which was meant to be sound, did seem to be sound and their technique wasn't sound. So rather than saying we believe that their technique is unsound because of this line of their paper, we were able to say it's not clear to us whether their approach is sound in principle, but we find that it is not sound in practice. And that's an objective way of getting around that prior work, and hopefully then having your much better articulated, hopefully, idea that then other people can then compare with in a more principled way, because it's clear. Okay? So saying we're not sure whether X provides this guarantee in principle, but we find in practice it doesn't, that can be a useful thing to do. This, of course, depends on people making their tools available. If they don't, then it's hard. And I think it can be difficult with theoretical work. But I know that, for instance, I know various people who work in separation logic and related areas to that, and there are all sorts of logics and arguments about, is it possible to, is my logic more expressive than your logic? It's like the separation logic analog of your IoT example, right? And I think that you can have difficulties there trying to differentiate, but you can try, you can do an example and try and do it in their logic too, and then you can explain why. You can then concretely say, we didn't know how to translate this construct into this logic because we couldn't figure it out, and you could be more specific than just saying we didn't understand that paper. Another thing, of course, you can do is you can contact the authors of that prior work and ask them for their opinion and their advice, and then you can cite personal communication. I thought I had that in here somewhere. Yeah. Another thing you can do, but this is a harder thing, is if a tool is not available, in principle you can actually re-implement it and evaluate. That's obviously not possible if it's a big piece of work that would take months to re-implement, but some algorithms might take days or weeks to re-implement, and it might just be worth biting the bullet and doing it and saying, this was unavailable, so we've done a best effort implementation based on our reading of the paper, and then give an experimental comparison. And that's something that, again, would typically be very well received by your peers who review your work. It shows that you've really gone that extra mile to do whatever you could to do a comparison with this work. And if works are not available for comparison, do say that in your paper, because you do get a lot of reviewers who just off the cuff say, oh, you should have compared with, and they list a whole load of papers that they've heard of but maybe haven't read very carefully, and they don't know that those papers are about tools that were never made available or that they're not that related. So do spell out why you've not done comparisons as well as the comparisons you have done. Okay, so I think the time is more or less up. So
actually, the question to everybody, also to you, Ali.
Yeah.
Time. So we have actually a half-hour break this time instead of 20 minutes. So how many people would like to see the last box?
Okay. So coping with a crowded field. There are a few things here. So suppose that you find out that the field you're working in is actually already very crowded. So maybe you know this, you come into it knowing it's going to be crowded, or maybe you find out that it's a bit crowded. One thing you can do is do a survey article if one doesn't already exist in the field. So I did my PhD work on symmetry reduction techniques for model checking, and that was the thing I kind of got into by accident. I was really interested in group theory when I was an undergraduate, and symmetry and model checking seemed a nice way to combine computer science and group theory. And I quickly found out that there were just loads and loads of papers already about symmetry reduction and model checking, and I wanted to try and find something that I could work on that would be my own area, something that I could work on in peace and make some progress on. And my PhD supervisor had the idea that we should actually write a survey article in this field, partly so that we could understand the literature really well, and partly because that would be a good service to other people who might come along and want to get an overall understanding of the work that was available. So we have this article, Symmetry in Temporal Logic Model Checking, from the ACM Computing Surveys Journal. And this is actually still just about my most highly cited paper, and it's probably had more impact on other people than the fairly decent work I did in my PhD on symmetry reduction techniques in the niche that I found. So, those works, I'm reasonably proud of those. Kind of glad I'm not working on it anymore. And remember that when you're doing a PhD, you don't have to work on your PhD topic forever, right? But yeah, this survey article I think is probably a useful resource to the community, and it was career-wise an article. I'm not particularly highly cited computer scientist, but of my papers, this is one of the more highly cited ones, and that's been a good thing for me to have done. The pros and cons of doing a survey: it can be a lot of work to do it well, so it's not an easy undertaking. You can't just dash off a survey. And if you do a good job of the survey, it can be a real service to the community. Obviously, if you do a poor job of the survey, but manage to get it published, that would be a disservice to the community. So please only do a survey if you're going to do a good, committed job of it. It can end up being very highly cited. Unfortunately, it may not count for some forms of academic assessment. So in the United Kingdom, we have a thing called Research Excellence Framework, where departments are evaluated every 5 or 6 years by the government, and survey articles would not count as an article you could put forward in your portfolio for the Research Excellence Framework. So it might be worth just thinking about that before you invest a lot of time in such an article. And a nice thing about a survey is that it can lead to novel research ideas. You read all these papers, you summarize them, you write them up, and naturally your brain is going to start thinking of cool things you could do to extend, and maybe some of them you'll find during the survey have already been done, but then when you finish the survey, you should be in a very good position. You might be a bit flummoxed with all the things that have been done, but you're at least in a good position to know that ideas you have are genuinely novel because you've done the survey. And you don't need to be an expert to do a survey. You can become an expert by doing the survey. Sometimes experts don't want to do the survey in their area, and a non-expert might come along and become an expert by reading all these papers and doing a good synthesis of them. Okay, a related thing is an empirical study. So a crowded field provides a lot of claims, and those claims are usually all positive, and they're not usually all true, or maybe they are all true, but they're all based on assumptions, and they're all based on different assumptions. So you can have 5 different papers. They're all the best, but they're all the best under assumption I, where I is 1 I per paper, right? So, and it's not always clear how fairly these things have been evaluated. And also, the techniques have probably come out in linear order, so it was never possible to evaluate all of them at the beginning, because they didn't exist. So if you have a crowded field that's a practical field and there are a bunch of tools available, you might consider doing an empirical study of those tools before you then go and make your own novel contributions in the field. And I've got a story here, which is actually, I had a student called Paul Thompson, who's now one of my colleagues at Google, thanks to this spin out. And he was doing his PhD work on stateless model checking. And he was having a pretty hard time finding a problem to work on in that field because it's a reasonably crowded field. And he had a load of benchmarks prepared, and he'd got a tooling framework up and running that he could run benchmarks in, and we were trying to work out what we should really do as the new contribution. And it was taking a lot longer than I or he had hoped. And actually, as a kind of as a last resort, not a last resort, it felt like a, oh, well, you know, shall we try and actually write something up? We did this empirical study on controlled scheduling techniques, which are related to stateless model checking. So what Paul did is he re-implemented a bunch of techniques from prior work. He got all the benchmarks he could find that people had used to evaluate these techniques and did an empirical study comparing all those techniques on all those benchmarks. Didn't propose anything new in the paper. And we sent this to the PPOP conference, and it was actually really well received by the reviewers. It was quite a pleasure to get back reviews that said, we really appreciate the effort you've gone to do this study. And he ended up getting Best Student Paper Award at that conference, and we were invited to do a longer version of the article for a special issue of a journal. And although Paul did go on to do pretty cool work in his PhD, I think this empirical study is the thing that will have the most lasting impact from his work. So I'm glad that he did that. It was very liberating doing the empirical study, because we weren't saying this is the best technique or that's the best technique. We were just saying, let's see. So there's no corner to fight. There's no need to justify decisions you made. All you're trying to do is explain the decisions you believe other people have made and fairly evaluate them. And that can be quite a nice thing to do if you're more used to writing your own papers, where inevitably there's a little bit of trying to market your own idea. It can be a really big service to the community if you do it well, or badly, it's a disservice. And again, like a survey, can end up being highly cited. And one thing that with an empirical study, if you collect a load of benchmarks up to do the study, those benchmarks themselves can be a useful, reusable artifact for the community. We've got something called SCT bench from that empirical study, which other people have been able to use. And again, that's another way of getting your work more highly cited for what that's worth. And once again, doing this kind of study can be a way of getting novel research ideas, just like doing a survey. And similarly, there's survey, there's empirical study. Another thing, I've not really done this due to lack of novelty. I've written tutorials before, but not as a, I don't quite know what to do, so I'll write a tutorial. But actually, if you have come to understand an area, writing a tutorial article can be less daunting than a survey. A survey should be somewhat encyclopedic. A tutorial could more be like a path through a field. You could show some examples and give a feeling of how a bunch of techniques work. And that, again, can be a useful contribution to your community. It could be something for you to dig your teeth into, and it will probably lead to novel research ideas. And another thing is, don't work in a crowded field. Right? That's a problem. That's a way you can get around the crowded field problem. I'm only joking here, except next time you moan about machine learning folks for getting all the money in the world, and no one's interested in whatever you're working on, then remember it kind of must be awful in a way to work in machine learning, because it must be so crowded and so difficult to differentiate, and maybe working on something a bit more compilery where it's crowded enough but it's not so crowded because compiler folks are kind of special. It's that can in a way be a pleasure, right? So working in a hot popular field might seem like the grass is greener, but in some ways the grass might not be greener. All right, so I wanted to conclude with the following observation, which is that There are two tools in program analysis that I think are really wonderful. The CLE tool, which is from various people, including my colleague Christine Kadar at Imperial, and also the CBMC tool, which is from Carnegie Mellon, and then the University of Oxford. These are program analysis tools that, in my opinion, have got very high impact. For example, there was an ICSI paper from a few years ago studying papers that were based on CLE. There are enough papers based on CLE that there could be an empirical study of papers based on CLE. And that shows how impactful CLE's been in academic circles. It has hundreds of users, maybe thousands of users. CBMC is this tool from Oxford, a binder model checker. There's a 4-page tool paper from the TACAS conference. That's the paper on CBMC. It's not a very novel tool. It's just a really, really good tool. And it's been cited thousands of times. It's led to this spin-out company, DiffBlue, who of course do AI for code. But I think they use CBMC to really good effect. And what I want to say is that these two pieces of work are really high impact, and they're genuinely not that novel. And I don't mean that as a criticism of those works. I think they're really good works. But if you read the CLE paper, it's packed with engineering detail. The CBMC paper isn't, because it's only 4 pages. But if you look at the source code of the tool, it's packed with engineering detail. And these tools have had a really lasting impact on our community. A much less impressive from a citations point of view, but personal experience for me is my graphics first project that I mentioned earlier. That's been really high impact for me, but it's probably one of the least novel pieces of work that I've done. But it was really fun to do, and it's led to adventures at Google that I'm really enjoying now. So what I would say is, if novelty is flowing, then enjoy it. But if novelty isn't flowing, then take comfort, because your most impactful work might be just about to happen. Okay, thanks very much for listening.
I had a question. Sort of, when you're in this, when you're trying to,
You need some coffee.
yeah, you need some coffee. Right, when you're doing the survey papers and stuff like that, I've heard people argue that even if that this is actually just how you should always start any project, right? The very first thing you should do in a project is you're already going to have to read every paper very quickly. So you might as well just start a project by writing a survey paper. What's your take on that?
So yeah, whether it's good to start a project by writing a survey paper. I think the downside to doing a survey is that it can be very daunting, and it can often lead to feeling like it's hopeless because everything's been done. And I think that a small amount of unconscious reinvention can be fine, actually. So sometimes picking something, working on it, and then discovering that something a bit similar has been done is often not the end of the world, and can sometimes lead to something happening as opposed to lots and lots and lots of reading going on. So yeah, I often do find I have to say to students, okay, it's great you've read all these things, but now you need to do something. Yeah. Okay, well, thanks. I'll come out for the coffee break if anyone wants to chat.
Yeah, you sticking around for the coffee break? Yeah. So Ali will be here if you want to just come ask some questions that are not broadcast to everybody. And we will be back at 4 when Kevin